There are not that many glossy gaming monitors out there on the market, but Asus are actually trying to change that with the ROG Strix OLED XG27AQDMG, not to be confused with its sibling which has got a similar sort of name. Now this monitor has got a flat 26.5 inch glossy WOLED panel that runs a resolution of 1440p and a refresh rate of up to 240Hz. It also has got the DisplayHDR True Black 400 certification and also adaptive sync technologies. Now at the time of filming, there is no concrete information about its price tag. However, via Asus UK, I have got a rough sort of indication of roughly £780 to £980 in the UK, while in the US it ranges from $700 to $750. Nonetheless, in this review, you can see if it's actually worth its price tag, depending on what sort of price tag you actually see it at, and to see how it compares to some of its competitors. So to kick things off, I thought I should talk about connectivity, and the reason this is important is because it will affect the maximum refresh rate and resolution you'll be able to achieve with this monitor. Now via its DisplayPort 1.4 input, you will be able to achieve the maximum 1440p at 240Hz. However, if you do connect up to one of the two HDMI 2.0 ports, you'll be limited to 1440p at 144Hz. So yes, indeed, it's very limiting if you're going to be connecting this up to a laptop or, for example, a GPU which just does not have a DisplayPort output. So just some food for thought. Now with that out of the way and with it connected over DisplayPort to my RTX 3080, I went ahead and did my tests. First off, we have to talk about input lag. And here I had it objectively tested at just 0.5 milliseconds. Indeed, it does a tremendous job. While playing a game such as Counter-Strike 2, I felt that my mouse inputs registered pretty much instantaneously. And sure enough, there's some other monitors out there that will boast even lower numbers, but in the grander scheme of things, this is actually very much suited for hardcore competitive gamers. Now the same could be said about its overall response time. The monitor indeed has got a glossy WOLED panel, and thanks to that technology, it means that the overall response time that this monitor can achieve is absolutely jaw-dropping. Now using the OSRTD tool at 240Hz, you'll be able to see that the average initial time sits at 0.72 milliseconds. Now the average initial time translates to average G2G, which a lot of manufacturers claim, and it is no surprise over here given it is an OLED monitor. You can also see that it hits 100% of the refresh rate window, which is yet again fantastic and very much sets itself aside from LCD monitors out there, in other words IPS VA or TNs. In comparison to other OLEDs, it's pretty much near on identical in terms of the overall response time that this monitor can achieve. Now, very much on that point, given that this monitor has got that OLED technology, it means you're not going to have any sort of overdrive settings like you'd find on some LCD panels, and as such means that you do not have any sort of inverse ghosting, as you will be able to hopefully see via this UFO ghosting test. At 240Hz, there are no sort of purple trails that go behind the UFO, therefore giving you a clear image. Speaking of which, this is the first OLED monitor that I've come across that actually has motion blur reduction technologies, and in Asus's terms it stands for ELMB, Extreme Low Motion Blur. And yes, indeed, it does have a positive effect, as you'll be able to see at 120Hz. It really does clear up that UFO, and therefore means that motion clarity is a lot better. However, the caveat is that ELMB can only be enabled at 120Hz, thus why I do not have a result at 240Hz or indeed 60Hz. The latter is not too important, but the former would have been great to see included. Alas, that is not the case, and therefore if you do want even superior motion clarity, you might want to look at an LCD panel, namely a TN panel out there with motion blur reduction technologies to give you an even sharper image. Subjectively, what I'll say is that the motion clarity on most OLEDs, including this Asus monitor, is absolutely spectacular, and I've got no issues whatsoever when it comes to seeing my enemies. On the notion of ELMB, it is worth also pointing out that it cannot be used simultaneously with adaptive sync technologies, in other words AMD FreeSync or Nvidia G-Sync. Indeed, if you are accustomed to Asus monitors out there, you'll find that ELMB Sync does indeed allow you to run all these technologies in tandem, but that's not the case with this OLED gaming monitor. Now, when it comes to adaptive sync technologies themselves, the VR range sits from 40 up to 240Hz, and is because it does not have a native G-Sync module. Indeed, it has got G-Sync compatibility instead. Now in my case, I've got an Nvidia RTX 3080, and when connected over DisplayPort to the monitor, I was able to run the Nvidia Pendulum demo. I didn't incur any sorts of flickering or black screen issues, which meant that Nvidia G-Sync was indeed running properly. Better still, I was able to go on a game like Destiny 2 at 1440p at 240Hz with Nvidia G-Sync enabled and also HDR. All of these were running in tandem and therefore meant that I had a tear-free gaming experience. Now this does actually bring me onto HDR, and quite frankly I do think this is one of the key selling points of this monitor. Not only because it's got the VESA DisplayHDR True Black 400 certification and therefore does get really deep blacks, but also because it has got a glossy panel. Indeed, this monitor has got a little bit of a unique selling point over semi-glossy or indeed matte-coated panels. And that is just simply the fact that the perceived black levels will be a lot darker in comparison to what else you can find out there on the market, be it LCD panels with TN, VA or IPS technology, or indeed OLED with that QD-OLED panel instead. Indeed, over here this WOLED does a phenomenal job. And given the fact that this monitor does also get pretty high in terms of the overall peak brightness in HDR, where I clocked in at roughly 720 to 750 nits, it means that you are still getting a very vibrant image. Now there is also something I thought I should highlight, is that unlike some other OLED monitors, namely QD-OLED panels out there that have got a dedicated True Black 400 mode, this monitor does not. And having confirmed this with Asus UK, they have mentioned that the three modes, Gaming HDR, Cinema HDR and Console HDR, the latter being the brightest out of the bunch, actually all have got the True Black 400 certification, and therefore means that there is no dedicated True Black 400 mode. Just something I thought I should mention because it is something that you might come across with some other OLED monitors out there, and furthermore, given that this mode does not exist and yet it does indeed have its True Black 400 certification, it might leave your head scratching like it did for me. Now there's also another thing to point out, is that this monitor does actually have a adjustable brightness in HDR. Of course this will affect the overall color accuracy that you'll be able to attain, but it's actually nice to see that you have got that level of adjustment. Not every monitor that has HDR does have this function, and I do actually think it's somewhat of a novelty, so it's great that Asus have actually implemented said feature because it allows you to customize the brightness even while using an HDR signal. Moving swiftly on, I thought I should have a quick word for console gamers. I'd never recommend getting a 240Hz monitor for purely console usage, but it might be good if you have it on the side. Now this monitor, as a reminder, does not have HDMI 2.1 ports, and therefore means you will not have adaptive sync technologies running over an HDMI signal. So this is just some food for thought. Nonetheless, you will be able to run 120Hz at 1440p or of course at 1080p as well. Now at 120Hz, I had it tested using the OSRDD tool, and yet again you can see that the average initial time sits at a stonkingly low 0.69 milliseconds, with the percent in window sitting at just 100%, which is absolutely fantastic. The same could be said at 60Hz, where the average initial time sits at 0.68 milliseconds, and yet again here the percent in window sits at a perfect 100%, therefore meaning that you're going to get fantastic response times from this monitor if you're going to be using it with a console, and the same could be said about its overall input lag. Now, in terms of the overall motion clarity, here you can see yet again the UFO ghosting test, where it's 120Hz. As a reminder, you do have ELMB, which you might want to enable, but you do also have the motion clarity at 60Hz, which of course is not going to be as good as the higher refresh rate ranges, but it's still fantastic to see. Now, I would also like to mention that this monitor does accept a 4K signal input, which might be handy in certain scenarios, and therefore means that you can downscale 4K to 1440p if it's appropriate. With the gaming section out of the way, how does the monitor actually look like? Well, as a reminder, it's got a flat 26.5-inch glossy WOLED panel that runs 1440p at 240Hz. Now via the monitor's OSD, there is also a dedicated sRGB calibration mode, which indeed does lock certain other settings, but you still have got brightness controls, which is very much appreciated. Now in said mode, I had its gamut coverage tested at 98.8% and its gamut volume at 104%, at least in comparison to the sRGB standard. Below you can see how it compares. As for the average DLT, it sits at 2.11 with a maximum of 3.85, which effectively means it could be used for some light image editing work or video grading, although it's not as low as you might expect in comparison to some alternatives out there on the market, which just seem to be a little bit more pinpoint accurate. Its sensitive contrast ratio sits at infinity to 1, while its measured white point is pretty close to the 6504 Kelvin target at 6780 Kelvin at 100%. However, its gamma curve is not all that impressive, specifically when it comes to its extremities. Looking at the 2.2 standard, which is what the sRGB mode would require, you can see that this monitor is a little bit off where it should be. Now, should you not be editing in the sRGB color space, I would actually highly suggest running this monitor on its other modes, because you'll get a wider color gamut, which effectively means that the image will pop a bit more. Now, there is a DCI-P3 mode, and therefore I actually thought to put it through its paces. I set the gamma at 2.6 via the monitor's OSD, which is required for DCI-P3, and indeed set the DCI-P3 mode via said setting. Now, in this mode, I had its gamut coverage tested at 96.6% and its gamma volume at 104.6%. You can see below how it compares to said standard. As for the average LTE, it sits at 1.77 with a maximum of 3.27. Indeed, yet again, it can be used for some light image editing work, although there's some other monitors out there, yet again, that actually do a little bit of a better job. As for its tested contrast ratio, it's still infinity to 1, while its measured white point does slightly shift at 6947 Kelvin at 100%. Yet again here, its gamma curve is a little bit off, specifically in terms of the extremities, and here in comparison to the 2.6 standard, not to be confused with the 2.2 standard that we used before, you can see it is not exactly hitting the mark. Now, before moving on, I would just like to point out something that I found a little bit odd. See, here when I was scrolling while watching a YouTube video, the tones would suddenly shift. And yes, they would resume as soon as I stopped scrolling, but I just found it to be really odd. Now, I changed browser to Microsoft Edge and also compared it with Google Chrome, and the same sort of phenomenon occurred, be it on the same video or different videos, so it meant that it wasn't not a browser issue. When I plugged in my own monitor, which is an IPS monitor, it did not incur any sort of problems, and therefore means that it's not a driver, GPU, or indeed a cable issue. And even more oddly, when I was using the Asus OLED monitor and then watching a regular video or indeed a movie, gaming, it did not incur the same sort of problem. So it seems to be some sort of issue that is picking up with a browser and therefore the way that the tones are being mapped and therefore skewing out some sort of issues. Hopefully this can be addressed, as I mentioned, but at least at the time of filming and via my own sample unit, this was actually a phenomenon that I just thought I should report on and therefore highlight in this review. Now, with all that out of the way, let's talk about brightness. And here in HDR, I clocked in between 720 to 756 nits, depending on which mode I actually used. And this is actually pretty impressive. As for SDR, it very much depends as to how you actually run it. For example, with the sRGB mode plus uniform brightness, it sits at 250 nits. In the wide mode, it sits at 240 nits. However, if I were to disable uniform brightness, it gets up to 400 nits, which is actually pretty good for an OLED monitor. As for ELMB, it will very much again depend on to how you're actually using it, but it will range between 121 to 160 nits. As for its minimum brightness, it gets all the way down to 28 nits. Now, what these figures effectively mean is that if you're going to be using this monitor in a bright sunlit room, you will still actually be able to use it. Similarly, if you're going to be using it in a completely pitch black environment, you'll also be able to utilize the monitor at its lower brightness levels. And therefore means that this monitor is quite versatile no matter the overall ambient light conditions that you're actually faced with. On the subject of peak luminance, this brings me on to brightness uniformity. And I do appreciate somewhat panel lottery, but my Tesla panel did a tremendous job across the board. The same could be said about the overall backlight bleed, which was simply non-existent. This image was actually taken in a completely pitch black room, but my camera tried to boost up the exposure, which is no surprise, but in this respect, all the pixels can be switched off thanks to the OLED technology, and therefore gives you a completely pitch black image with no sort of bleed appearing in any sort of the corners. Now, this actually perfectly brings me on to the subject of having a glossy panel as a PC monitor. And I did cover its benefits of having deeper blacks when you're running it, for example, with an HDR signal. And if you have got a completely pitch black room, you're going to be really able to benefit from what a glossy panel is able to offer to you. If, however, you're going to be running it in a bright room, or for example, you have a window positioned behind you and therefore reflecting off the monitor, it's actually going to take away from the overall experience you're going to be able to attain, purely because you're getting much more reflections and you can't actually see as clearly as you might expect in comparison to comparing it with a semi-glossy or indeed a matte coated panel, which the latter is pretty much the industry standard. Now, where I sit with it is the fact that I do actually use my monitor mainly during the day, and as a result it meant that I was not able to really appreciate the glossy panel because I actually preferred the matte coating, because it meant that I just had less reflections. When the nighttime came in and I was gaming, I then fully appreciated why I was actually having a glossy panel in front of me, and therefore meant that I was actually able to get the best out of this monitor. So it really depends as to where you stand and how you're going to be using your monitor, in what sort of ambient light conditions, and what is the most important to you. Now, another thing I thought I should highlight is the limitations of owning an OLED monitor, because this might be of importance for those people who are transitioning from an LCD monitor, in other words IPS, VA and TN. Now, first off, you should know that the Asus do provide a 3-year warranty, and there's also a custom heatsink with a fanless design, so therefore you're not going to be able to hear any sort of noise while using this monitor in a completely quiet environment. And I've got sensitive ears, and I can definitely say there are no issues whatsoever in this respect. Now, there are also a bunch of OLED care technologies that the manufacturers provided via the OSD and also via the software, and here you've got the likes of pixel cleaning, which will have to be done every so often, and it can be done when the monitor goes in standby, therefore not giving you any sort of downtime. And you've also got, for example, screensaver and also a logo protection as well. All of these are very much appreciated, and certain things that you might want to utilize in order for you to mitigate and indeed minimize the overall burn-in effect, which might be something of a concern for those people who are looking to get this monitor. Now, elsewhere, something I thought I should highlight is the fact this monitor uses WOLED technology, and therefore its sub-pixel layout is going to be different from an LCD monitor, and in comparison to some recent QD-OLEDs that I've reviewed, it doesn't actually look as good. Now, the manufacturer has tried to mitigate it yet again by implementing a technology. It's called Pixel Edge, but in all honesty, this just makes everything look quite blurry. And yes, it might minimize the fringing effect, but by the result of everything looking quite blurry, it's kind of defeating the purpose of actually using the monitor at 1440p. Now, when it comes to the fringing effect, it's something that you might be able to notice in certain scenarios. As I look at a lot of text, because I'm also a journalist, it actually meant that it did actually throw me off a little bit while using this monitor on a day-to-day usage. Yes, indeed, you do get used to it over time, but when you do compare and contrast it with a QD-OLED, specifically a third-generation panel, or indeed an LCD monitor, you'll be able to quickly see that there are some differences over here. Yes, this WOLED performs pretty much like some other WOLEDs out there on the market, but that's not exactly necessarily a good thing. Hopefully the images over here with the annotations will give you an indication of how this monitor compares with some other monitors out there on the market in terms of the different technologies that are offered, and therefore it's just something that you should certainly consider if you're using this monitor for any sort of productivity usage. So with that out of the way, I would like to talk about its build quality. And here it's got a four-side borderless design, and given the fact it's got a 26.5-inch form factor and a thin sort of profile, it means it won't take up too much space on your desk. I also love the fact that the stand has got a sort of bin-tilt inlet, which allows you to place your smartphone, handy in certain scenarios. Now, the stand itself is also very sturdy and provides you good sort of ergonomics. You've got height, tilt, and also swivel adjustments, although it cannot be pivoted. If this is something that you're looking for, you might want to replace the built-in stand with a VESA-compatible stand, and therefore allowing you to place it on a multi-monitor setup or a singular monitor arm. Now, should you keep the built-in stand, you'll be placing it as a smaller screw thread at the top of it, allowing you to place a camera or, for example, a webcam, which can be handy in certain scenarios. Now, at the back of the monitor, you might have noticed some RGB lights, which I do think are completely redundant because they're not bright enough to be shining on your wall. Nonetheless, they support Aura Sync, allowing you to synchronize them with some other peripherals if, of course, they are supported in the first place. At the front of the monitor, you've also got a little power LED icon, but this can be disabled, giving you a bit more of that flushed out design. Now, for you to access said settings and to disable some of these things, you will have to go via the monitor's OSD. This can be accessed via small little joystick buttons that's found at the center and behind the monitor. Now, the OSD itself is very comprehensively laid out and provides you a plethora of different options. It's also nice to see that you've got quite a few crosshair options as well, which might be handy for certain gamers. Not something that I utilize, but nonetheless it's good to see that Asus have included them. My only complaint, however, is that I wish that the OLED panel care was its dedicated menu, rather than having to delve into the settings and then find it in there. Indeed, it's something that you might access regularly, given it's an OLED monitor after all, and here I would just wish that Asus just made it a little bit easier to access. Nonetheless, it's a small little complaint to have. Equally over here, I would also like to mention that each time I opened the monitor's OSD, I found some sort of lines on the screen. These disappeared, of course, as soon as I disabled the monitor's OSD, but I just found it a little bit odd. Hopefully this can be addressed via future firmware updates, but it's just something I thought I should highlight in this review. Now, as an extension of the monitor's OSD, you've also got a software. It's called the Asus Display Widget Center. This allows you the same sort of controls via the monitor's OSD, and to a degree you've actually got more customization with certain software that you can utilize. You might want to utilize this via connecting up via DisplayPort, or also the USB Type A to Type B cable, which is provided within the box. Now, on that note, the monitor has got two USB Type A ports, which allow you to connect up, for example, peripherals, and you've also got a 3.5mm jack output. The reason I'm mentioning this is because the monitor has not got any sort of built-in speakers, and therefore if you do want to route audio via the monitor, you'll have to use the 3.5mm jack, or of course just use a set of bookshelf speakers or DAC, or headphones, or indeed a headset with your custom setup. So with all that in mind, it brings me on to my verdict, and truthfully I can recommend this monitor for certain gamers out there. Indeed, those people who want a glossy panel and can use it in their own room, in other words not getting too much reflections. Those people who actually want a fantastic HDR experience because of that, and also have got a low input lag and a good sort of response time given it's an OLED panel. Furthermore, you're getting 1440p at 240Hz with decent color accuracy, a comprehensively laid OSD and good sort of build quality. As a result of all of this, and given the fact that it comes in at a pretty competitive price, I do appreciate it's still pretty expensive at $700 to $750 in the US, or indeed $780 to £980 in the UK, it still actually does come in at a pretty good price, and as a result it gets my performance award. However, it's worth considering that I wouldn't wholeheartedly recommend this monitor, purely because of that glossy panel. You're going to get a lot more reflections. Furthermore, there's some other monitors out there on the market that come in at a cheaper price point, or indeed come in at roughly the same sort of price, be it in the US or in the UK, but offer even more features. All the ones that I've reviewed and the ones I would recommend and ones that would actually compare with this OLED monitor will be down in the description below for your own consideration. Now I'd be curious to know what you make of this Asus OLED glossy panel down in the comment section below, and how you feel it compares with some of the other monitors out there on the market. Now if you have enjoyed this detailed independent review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification. All of which would be greatly appreciated and allows me to continue delivering honest reviews like this one. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.